Today provide you with in-depth news and expert analysis, tell you the whole story and the bigger picture. Bring you the news you want to know only on Today.
Welcome to World Today, the panel discussion with me, Anna, in Beijing. Heavy shelling between Armenian and Azerbaijani forces have been reported around the disputed Nagorno-Karabakh region as the fighting raged for 6 days, with both sides refusing to back down and hit international calls for talks. The fiercest clashes between the two in years over the region were ignited on Sunday, leaving casualties from both sides. Our reporter has more from Istanbul.
The clashes between Armenia and Azerbaijan erupted on Sunday morning. Leaders of both countries accused each other of triggering the latest violence. Armenian officials declared martial law, as did Azerbaijan. Now, Azerbaijan also stated that it would be launching a counter-offensive operation along the entire front for the safety of its civilian population, while Armenia's defense ministry stated that it has shot down several helicopters, drones, as well as destroying several tanks that belong to Azerbaijan. Now, Azerbaijan's president accused Armenia for triggering the latest violence and also for being responsible for this happening for a long time now. Let's listen to his comments.
Recently, Armenia's military provocations against Azerbaijan have become regular. In July, our servicemen and a civilian were killed as a result of artillery fire in the direction of Tovuz on the Armenian-Azerbaijani border.
The two former Soviet countries, Armenia and Azerbaijan, have been at a conflict for a very long time now, for decades actually, and in 1990s they fought a war. In 2016, once again, escalation of violence left over 200 people dead. So this latest escalation of violence and fighting could also prove to be very dangerous. There were harsh reactions from Turkey as a close ally of Azerbaijan. Turkish officials made several statements. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan first of all stressed Turkey's solidarity with Azerbaijan. The Turkish Foreign Ministry accused Armenia of violating international law, while Turkey's Defense Minister Hulusi Akar emphasized that Baku would be supported by all means. This, of course, was not welcomed by Armenia. There was a statement made by Armenian Prime Minister. Let's listen to his comments.
Turkey's aggressive behavior, which had a very dangerous manifestation, especially during the July events, and continues up to this day, causes serious concern. The fact that Turkey is maintaining such dangerous behavior is fraught with the most devastating consequences for the South Caucasus and adjacent regions.
There were other reactions as well. The EU Foreign Affairs Chief called for a cessation of hostilities, de-escalation, as well as a strict observance of a ceasefire. Similar calls for negotiations were made by Russia and France as well. Michal Bardavit in Istanbul.
So will Armenia and Azerbaijan clash turn into a full-scale war, and could the conflict destabilize the region as it raises concern of a wider conflict that could draw in regional powers, Turkey and Russia, and can it be resolved diplomatically at this point? To answer these questions and more, we're joined by Makili-Aliyev, affiliated researcher at Lowell Wallenberg Institute in Sweden. He worked as a senior research fellow at the Center for Strategic Studies under the President of the Republic of Azerbaijan. Ronald Gregor Suni, professor of history and political science at the University of Michigan. He was also the first holder of the Alexei Manugin Chair in Modern Armenian History at the University of Michigan, where he founded and directed the Armenian Studies program. And Alexei Muraviev, associate professor at the School of Media, Creative Arts, and Social Inquiry at Curtin University in Australia. He has published widely on matters of Russia's strategic and defense policy. Welcome, gentlemen.
Glad to be here.
So let's start with the basics here. Ronald, could you please give us a brief introduction of the history of the Nagorno-Karabakh region and how has Armenians seen this region?
Nagorno-Karabakh is the territory that de jure is inside Azerbaijan today. Historically, it's an area that went back and forth between a variety of different rulers, and in modern times, largely it was the home of a number of what we call Armenian melikdoms, that is, little principalities and so forth. that eventually, early in the 19th century, were conquered by Russia. That is, they moved from Iranian suzerainty to Russian suzerainty, and they stayed within the Russian Empire. And then when the Soviet Union was formed, that area, which was about 90% in population Armenian, was put into the Azerbaijani Republic because of Azerbaijan being a far richer republic, oil riches and so forth, and Armenia was quite devastated after World War I, given the Armenian genocide and the Turks, refugees, poverty, disease, etc. And so for the next 70 years, that little region, Nagorno-Karabakh, mountainous Karabakh, was an autonomous region within Azerbaijan. The population of Armenians in that area fell from about 90% to 75%. And there were repeated times during the Soviet period that the Armenians of Karabakh and Armenians in Armenia and elsewhere wanted to bring that region, according to Leninist nationality policy, national self-determination, into Armenia. But the Soviet government never permitted that. When the Gorbachev government began and reform started, there were demonstrations, people on the streets, etc., to bring Karabakh into the Armenian Republic. And those demonstrations were answered quite brutally by massacres of Armenians in a small city, industrial city called Sumgait. And then the conflict began and has gone on for the next 30 plus years.
Kamal, is that how Azerbaijanis see the region?
Well, if we'll be talking about how Ronald presented it, I would say most of the information that he said is accurate, except I would add that Melikdoms that he referred to in the 19th century were part of the Karabakh Khanate, which was also under sovereign of the Persian Empire, and the ruler of the region was actually an Azerbaijani in the 19th century. Plus, in that time when the Russia have captured these areas from Persia, this 90% of population in Karabakh of Armenians became so high at 90% because of the relocation of Armenians from other parts of Persia, which of course created somewhat of a destabilization of the region in ethnic terms, but also served Russians to have a sort of a buffer in terms of having a Christian population on its border lines with Ottoman and Persian Empire. When the Soviet Union became a sovereign over the territory and this region was included into the Azerbaijani Soviet Socialist Republic, this was done, of course, because of economical reasons, but also because economy, in a sense, was motivated by the connections that the Nagorno-Karabakh region had to Azerbaijan, including 5 entryways, so the 5 routes that you can take from mainland Azerbaijan into the Nagorno-Karabakh mountainous region, as opposed to only one connecting it to mainland Armenia. When it comes to the 1980s, late 1980s events, we can also add that the inter-ethnic violence did not only been provoked in Sumgait. Sumgait was one of the biggest events of the inter-ethnic violence, but the inter-ethnic violence first and foremost started in the Nagorno-Karabakh region itself. In the city of Askeran, 2 young men have been killed by the mob of Armenians, and even before that, the tensions and clashes, inter-ethnic clashes, have been there, and they have been recorded. So it then spread to both countries, and of course the Sumgait is one of the most famous ones, but it's not the only one. There's have also been inter-ethnic clashes and large-scale crackdown on Azerbaijanis in Armenia, for example, in Zangezur region, and this has also led to deaths in Azerbaijani population. So both sides have suffered, I would say, a lot in the 80s. And then this turned with the dissolution of the Soviet Union into a very, very, very large military scale war between two newly formed states. Thank you.
That's two versions of history collided on the same path. So, Alexei, how do international community like the UN or related powers like Russia see the region?
Well, they obviously see it as the region of strategic significance, given the fact that the Southern Caucasus represent a really important connecting point with regards to geopolitics of pipelines on one hand, then colliding of or center of collision of geopolitical and geostrategic interest of regional powers. We have the presence of Iran, we have the presence of Turkey, we have the presence of Russia there, apart from resident states, and obviously having this region geographically close to the Middle East, which is obviously being viewed as an area of great geopolitical upheaval. Recently, it's only been viewed with a great degree of concern. There were issues concerning secession, there was issues concerning separatism, there were issues with regards to terrorism and insurgency, and obviously the prospect of a regional conflict. Nagorno-Karabakh obviously been viewed as a long-standing flashpoint, even though limited in scale. It's still been considered to be something that could potentially flare up tensions, broader tensions, and engulf well beyond a relatively small disputed area involving, as this latest escalation has demonstrated, regional power centers, but also something that can potentially have detrimental effect on, for example, oil prices, even though the energy markets recently have been demonstrating increasing resilience to any turbulences that are happening across the world, but nonetheless, a possibility that the conflict may compromise the steady supply of energy resources by means of pipelines or transit via the Caspian Sea, simply because of the near proximity of the conflict on one hand, then potentially seeing deterioration of tensions between, say, Turkey and Russia, which in this particular conflict have more significant stakes than ever. Potential involvement of Iran, and Iran can be viewed as a standalone case study, obviously makes it look a potentially serious matter, even though right now, from the global geopolitical perspective, it doesn't obviously grab international headlines, rather than something everyone considers to be a matter of concern, but not a matter of strategic significance, and not obviously being used in the same way as some other hotspots. However, having said that, recent reports about apparent relocation of some of the militant forces from Syria, which has been confirmed not only by the Russian authorities but also by France and the United States, may actually bring more international attention onto this regional hotspot, because if that is confirmed, and this is something that has a potential of being linked to ongoing problems of insurgency and intrastate conflict in Syria and Libya, then it obviously will draw more of international attention, and particularly if the level of confrontation, the level of armed conflict will remain as high as it is right now.
About the conflict between the two nations, Ronald, how do you understand the substantial divergence between Azerbaijan and Armenia in this matter?
Well, there are lots of ways people interpret this, right? They see it as a Muslim-Christian conflict. They see it as a territorial conflict. They see it as, various kinds of ethnic, long-term tribal conflicts, etc. This is a political, strategic, territorial conflict. Two different nations are claiming the same piece of territory. Azerbaijan's claim is based on the international principle of territorial integrity. International system, the international law says that Karabakh is part of Azerbaijan. The Armenians are making an argument based on national self-determination. That is, the majority of this population, no one would dispute this, for hundreds of years, and certainly even during the Soviet period, was Armenian. And Armenians who lived under Azerbaijani control complained and felt that they weren't being treated fairly and so forth. They certainly didn't live as well as Armenians across the border in Armenia. And so these discontents arose, and eventually when the heavy hand of Soviet rule was slightly lifted around the late 1980s, they demonstrated for their annexation and to move into Armenia. And so that's the nature of the conflict. It's about two different principles. Some people will claim, no, this has always been Armenian territory because it's historically been Armenian. Some will argue, no, these people were originally under Azerbaijani rulers, or they weren't called Azerbaijanis then necessarily. They were Muslim rulers or Persian rulers or whatever. The main point is, demographically, in terms of population, this has been an Armenian region, and they want a kind of self-rule. And understandably, Azerbaijan, which claims this as its territory, is unwilling to accept that this part of their, as they conceive it, homeland, this is the problem with nationalizing states in the world, will go to the neighboring states. So you have a serious conflict. It's a conflict that's very difficult to compromise on, because it would mean the removal of one side to another. We tried, many of us early on, 30 years ago, to propose, various kinds of compromises, de jure or Azerbaijani suzerainty over the area, but de facto rule by the local population. Nothing worked. Compromise was out of the question. The war started. The Armenians actually won that war. It was brutal. It's still brutal. And now Azerbaijan has decided that it's going to use military means to try to change the status quo. Armenians don't have an interest in a war with Azerbaijan because they've got the territory. They want the status quo. They don't want to move. Azerbaijan, on the other hand, backed by Turkey and now apparently by mercenaries from Syria, wants to change the status quo, has given up on negotiation, and has turned to violence.
Kamal, how do you view the vast historical and political divide between the two?
Well, continuing on what Ronald said, he has absolutely clearly identified the claims under the international law that the sides are claiming. Azerbaijan claims territorial integrity, and Armenia claims right of peoples to self-determination. The problem with that is, and I actually wrote a book on that, and on the possibility of solving this conflict through the international legal means, is that the right of peoples to self-determination needs to have a peoples to self-determine. And the problem with Nagorno-Karabakh is that its population is not a separate peoples from either Armenia or Azerbaijan. From either Armenian or Azerbaijani people. They have ethnic connection to Armenia because they are ethnically Armenian and religiously Armenian, and they're also de jure a part of the peoples of Azerbaijan, as Ronald said, because that's the territorial integrity claim and the connection that have been there with those Armenians have been, even in the Soviet time, treated as a part of population of Azerbaijan and peoples of Azerbaijan, which has been at least on paper, sovereign territory within the Union. So that creates a situation where the international law is clearly on the side of Azerbaijan. But of course, on the other hand, there is a problem of Armenian population and its basic security, which is what actually Armenia's biggest problem with the whole situation is. Armenia, on the other hand, when it won the war, it expelled the rest of Azerbaijani population out of Nagorno-Karabakh, and around the surrounding regions that it also occupied when it was fighting for Nagorno-Karabakh. And that created a very strange situation on the ground where you have basic mono-ethnicity of on the region in question. And when you have in the region in question a mono-ethnicity, the dialogue between the two nations basically is almost impossible on the local, in the local sense, and that creates a huge problem. The solution of the autonomy could have worked before, and I still am pretty sure that this is a workable solution. But just as Veron noted, because the sides have such an opposite understanding of the conflict and understanding of their positions, and that those clearly seem to be unreconcilable, the better way would be not to proceed with mediation efforts, but to go into arbitration. Mm-hmm. And that's what should be imposed by the international community here, is not a mediation, by arbitration. Yeah, thank you.
So, Alexei, conflicts occurred in the region from time to time, but what made the most recent one the heaviest fighting in years? What has changed?
Well, obviously, a set of geostrategic circumstances. One is that both countries, and certainly Azerbaijan, have been continuously engaged in qualitative buildup of their military capabilities. So both countries have learned a lot since their latest clash, which happened back in April 2016. They took lessons, they realized their weaknesses and deficiencies, they realized what sort of capabilities they have required, because despite significant disproportion of the population and through that mobilization resources, Azerbaijan is roughly 4 or 5 times larger in terms of population size compared to Armenia. In terms of standing military capability, they're roughly comparable. So neither of the sides have any competitive edge which would allow them to achieve immediate military success. There's been deepening relationship, security and defense relationship between Azerbaijan and Turkey, and in fact, the two countries just concluded a set of military exercises that they were running together on Azerbaijani territory, and quite often exercises could be viewed as a precursor for more serious political and military actions, because you have combat-ready forces that already been pre-deployed, pre-positioned, received some training, achieved a degree of coordination. And the fact that Turkey had military presence, at least for the time of these joint exercises, allow the Armenians to develop a narrative saying that Turkey is not just supporting Azerbaijan politically and declaratory, but also supports it militarily through the continuous deployment of core military capabilities, ranging from special forces to military instructors, to commanders and military advisors, to even combat aircraft, even though this argument has been fiercely denied and disputed by both Azerbaijanis as well as the Turks. So I guess it was and the buildup was occurring over a few weeks' time, when Azerbaijan mobilized some of its units in preparation, at least formally, for those exercises. There have been some troop movements also formally under the legend.
Okay, thanks, gentlemen. Let's have a short break here. You're listening to World Today. Stay with us. You are listening to the panel discussion of World Today. I'm Gana in Beijing. International concerns is growing over rapidly escalating turmoil in the Nagorno-Karabakh region. How has international powers positioned themselves in the confrontation? Let's continue our panel discussion on Armenia and Azerbaijan conflict. Kamal, do you think the balance of military power has changed fundamentally, that Azerbaijan could now go further than it did 4 years ago? What do you make of the tough stance Azerbaijan holds this time?
If we're talking about a 4-year period, I wouldn't say that the balance of power shifted extremely from that point in time to now. Azerbaijan have been developing its defense capabilities for quite some time, especially after the war in the beginning of 1990s, up from 1994, and until today have been heavily investing in its military defense capabilities. Between 2016 and now, I wouldn't say it was such a progress, but if we would think more from the perspective of 90s to now, it of course have been very, very high. And the development of its armed forces, if they outnumber, both in terms of personnel and capabilities, the Armenian armed forces. In this sense, we can say that a lot of progress in that front have been made. So Azerbaijan surely feels much more sure of itself and its capabilities to have military operations in Nagorno-Karabakh, in deoccupying its territories, if that's what you're asking.
Ronald, what do you make of it? Why has it gotten so bad so fast?
Yes, that's a good question. Because when you have the outbreak of a war like this, you have to ask, why now? Why hasn't this happened before? There have been skirmishes before, but this is really a major escalation. And I think you have to look at the outside actors and the inside actors. So as I mentioned, Armenia was perfectly happy with the status quo. They were in good shape. They have to worry about Azerbaijan's military buildup. But then there are the two powers, Turkey and Azerbaijan, which both would like to change the status quo, and both are having internal problems. In Turkey, Erdogan is faced with economic crisis, his own imperial overreach. He's now in Libya, where he's facing the Russians and the locals, in Syria, where he's pushed out the Americans, in the Aegean Sea with the Greeks, and so forth. And so there's a kind of incentive to try to deal with this aching wound in the Caucasus. And Azerbaijan is a difficult country for someone outside to talk sensibly about, because it's a very closed society. Unlike Armenia, it's not democratic. It's a country where the Aliyev regime has crushed dissent, but there is a discontent, and there is a problem with the falling oil prices. And there's been a push by Azerbaijanis to sort of solve this aching wound, this Karabakh problem, and eventually the government decided that maybe this is the time to sort of rally around the flag and go forth with this adventure against Armenia.
Alexei, as our guest mentioned earlier, despite the military confrontation in the disputed region, a war of words have also erupted over reports that Turkey has sent thousands of Syrian fighters to Azerbaijan to support its Muslim-majority ally. So what does that mean to the situation on the ground? Will Turkey's support further complicate the already complicated situation in the region?
Well, it seems like it does, and in fact, I would actually argue that Turkey may have actually indeed been the trigger point behind the escalation of tensions, because despite the fact that Azerbaijan has obviously has the concept of liberating Nagorno-Karabakh as part of its national psyche now, and for Armenia, defending it at all costs has also become part of the national psyche. Neither side probably feels confident enough to achieve decisive success. And as my distinguished fellow panelist has already indicated, the Armenians don't have to do anything about this. They're happy to hold the ground. They're happy to control the territory. They do so. The ball is actually in the hands of Azerbaijan, and I would still argue that Azerbaijan hasn't really reached the stage when it would feel overwhelmingly superior to Armenia to undertake it on its own accord. However, Turkish President Erdogan has been demonstrating fairly dangerous adventurism in recent years, and certainly This year alone, we've seen Turkey's heavy involvement in Libya, his unilateral actions in Syria that in both cases contributed to escalation of regional tensions. More recently, standoff with Greece and France in Eastern Mediterranean, and now Turkish warning rhetoric about effectively presenting the fight in Nagorno-Karabakh as Turkish fight rather than Azerbaijan fight. This whole idea of one nation, two states, and treating this fight as an attack on Turkey is something that is fairly concerning. And if the reports are true that Turkey is using its paramilitaries that they have trained and funded for the fight in Syria and moved some of these assets to Libya, it does represent an escalation of tensions, but it also really raises the question, if we're talking about possible political negotiations, starting some sort of a dialogue, whom to talk to. Should we call Baku? Should we be calling Baku and Yerevan, or should we be reaching and dialing Ankara in the first instance, apart from Moscow, apart from Paris, and apart from perhaps New York and Washington? So that what really gets these things complicated, and it also helps to explain perhaps the ferocity of the crisis. The point I certainly want to make is, despite all the reporting about on both sides on how many hundreds and thousands of personnel they managed to kill, which is obviously grossly exaggerated, there haven't been any reporting of prisoners. It doesn't seem that either side is taking any prisoners during this conflict, which also indicates how ferocious the fighting is on the ground. And perhaps that can also be explained by illustrations provided, for example, by the Armenian authorities, which no longer look at this as a fight between them and Azerbaijan, rather than a fight between them and Turkey, which brings them back to the point that they have faced Turkey-led genocide during World War I, and they don't want to see the repetition of it now. So they've actually transformed this whole narrative about being involved in this conflict as not the fight for Nagorno-Karabakh, rather than fight for the survival of Armenia as a nation.
Kamal, how do you view Turkey factor in the situation today?
Yes, I would first of all want to address what Ron and Alexis said, and while a lot of their points are very, very much reasonable, but I would caution a little bit, and from looking at the situation sometimes from the more critical point of view as well. While there is this understanding that the Turkey gives its support right now very starkly, it also have to be noted that Turkey have been supporting Azerbaijan quite openly since the beginning of the conflict. For a good example is that from 1993, the border between Turkey and Armenia is closed, and there are no diplomatic relations on the official level. So the Turkey as a factor have been there for quite some time. Now, if we'll be talking about Azerbaijan's reasoning right now to be engaged so much in the conflict, we still have to understand that for Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh problem was number one item on its foreign policy agenda always. So saying that right now it's an opportune time to address the problem number one seems for me a little bit oversimplification of the situation. And as well, I would want to point out that if we're talking about how Azerbaijan feels about its powers, it seems like it is showing it, demonstrating it, that it's quite sure that it can, at least from Azerbaijan's point perspective, that it can have considerable success on the military field when it comes to the Nagorno-Karabakh, because the fighting right now is on the scale of outright war, and I wouldn't even call it an escalation anymore. It seems like it's already in the state of full-scale war, and it doesn't seem to be de-escalating at all, or even fluctuating. So that's also another another indicator of sureness of Azerbaijan in its own situation. The Turkey's role there, of course, there have been reports about the Syrian fighters. Those have not been yet confirmed from the evidence on the ground. However, if true, it's very surprising and questions the necessity of such measures. As far as I understand, they would be only they would not support Azerbaijani national army in any kind of way. They would be more in the way of fighting rather than complementing in any way, or even being a factor that can turn the tide in favor of Azerbaijan. So the reason for such measures it escapes me completely, even if the reports have been coming about the recruitment of such fighters. So what kind of role the Syrian fighters would play there in the decision making on the battlefield? I would say close to zero in any way, if reports would be proven or unproven. That leaves the only part is actually official participation of Turkey as the side of an armed conflict, intervening with its official military forces. That would, of course, change the picture considerably, but it doesn't seem, as of now, that Turkey is going to go there in full force and live up to its promises, even of participating in the battlefield, as the guarantees, official guarantees from Russia to Armenia, for example, are also formally there in terms of its common security pact within the CSTO, the Organization of Collective Security Treaty Organization. This is a kind of alternative of NATO in the post-Soviet space. However, they still have not been acted upon, and I would say the Turkish role is approximately the same. Strong statements, but for now it doesn't seem that any of the sides, either Turkey or Russia, are going to follow up on the collective security promises or even formal obligations.
Indeed. Speaking of Russia, Ronald, let's talk about Russia. Russia is part of a military alliance with Armenia and has a military base in the country. However, it also has close ties with the government of Azerbaijan, and both of them were part of the Soviet Union. So what role is Russia playing based on your understanding?
Yes, Russia has supplied military equipment to both Armenia and Azerbaijan, but in general, most people think it's closer to Armenia, and it has that base there. This is the situation with Russia. First of all, Putin has a lot on his plate right now. There's conflict in Belarus. There are he has troops in Syria and Libya, and he doesn't want a big conflict in the Caucasus as well. But Putin has made it very clear that there is a red line that you can't cross. He does not want foreign troops or NATO or any kinds of serious intervention into any other part of the former Soviet Union. That's what the Ukraine conflict was about. That's what the 2008 war in Georgia was about. And if Turkey actually made a move in some more overt way toward Armenia, that would launch a very serious crisis with Russia. I don't think Erdogan is that stupid. He's using much more subtle means, sending these Syrian mercenaries. These are, by the way, extraordinarily brutal people. They've been trained by Turkey. They were used in the war against the Kurds in Syria that drove them back from the Turkish frontier and destroyed the democratic experiment in Rojava in northern Syria. So I think that Russia is a key player here. I would not be surprised if in the next week or so Putin calls Erdogan, talks to Erdogan, and they settle this and mediate this crisis and stop the war. That would be, I think, the most optimistic scenario. But as I said, Putin has so many different things on his plate, all the way from Khabarovsk in the Far East, the Navalny controversy and difficulty with the poisoning and its relationship with Europe, Belarus. He doesn't need the Caucasus.
But Turkey has been deploying its troops in Syria, facing a military standoff with Greece, and now actively involved in this. So, Ronald, how do you understand the strategic plans here? Knocked by COVID-19 pandemic and domestic economic crisis, is Turkey capable of continuing to walk down this path?
I think there's a very useful political science concept called imperial overreach or imperial overstretch. That is, certain megalomaniac leaders do get the idea that they can use this power they have domestically in foreign affairs as well. And you see that Turkey is in fact causing trouble now, both in its western frontier, in the Aegean Sea with Greece, in the south with Syria, in Libya, and now in the Caucasus as well. Now, it seems to me that this is partly a response to Erdogan's domestic insecurity. In elections, Turkey is divided right down the middle. About 50% of the population is not pro-Erdogan, maybe just less than 50%. And that 50% represents the cities. That represents the intelligentsia. Now, Erdogan has in fact crushed opposition within the country, the Kurdish rebellions and resistances in the southeast. He's arrested intellectuals. He's now campaigning and arresting Kurdish intellectuals, members of the most democratic party in Turkey, the HDP, the HDP. So he's facing his own crisis economically, politically, sort of culturally, hegemonically, and diverting attention to foreign policy, rallying the nationalist forces. He's now made an alliance with right-wing nationalist party, the MHP. These kind of things have led to, I think, a destabilization, serious destabilization of that region. And this is a very dangerous moment, I think, in that whole region, the Middle East, the Aegean, and the Caucasus.
Alexei, will Russia take further moves if Turkey continues to make a strong presence in the region?
Well, without doubt. I mean, I don't think the Russians would want to take sides right this moment. They would prefer to act as the mediator and demonstrate not only to Armenia and Azerbaijan, but more importantly to the outside world that this is their immediate neighborhood. Russia wants to act as an empire in this sense and demonstrate that this conflict falls firmly within its sphere of influence and it has means other than military means to negotiate this. I completely agree with Ronald about that Putin doesn't want to have an extra problem on his plate, but he doesn't want to see Islamization of the conflict. I mean, and in this sense, he was happy to show Erdogan in the past not only red lines, but effectively a clear fist, particularly at the time when Turkey downed Russian bomber in Syria, which nearly brought the two countries on the brink of a full-scale conflict. And certainly in this sense, Russia will not going to hesitate to use all means necessary to bring Turkey back into its box. Having said that, I will also argue that Russia is not going to simply take sides and commit militarily to Armenia, even though they have allied obligations through CSTO treaty, as Kamal referred to, and the fact that Armenia was trying to bring Russia into the conflict when it injected this unconfirmed news that Turkish aircraft allegedly downed an Armenian fighter jet, and Russia didn't buy that fake news, is a demonstration that Russia, on one hand, wants to stay above the fight, regardless of allied obligation to Armenia, but also doesn't want to compromise its special relationship with Azerbaijan. But standing above the fight also means not only to try to mediate between the two warring sides, but also keep any other parties involved out of the conflict. That meaning keeping Turkey in bay, keeping Turkey in its box, and ensuring that Erdogan's militarism and adventurism will not cause any more difficulties in southern Caucasus.
Ronald, Russian President Vladimir Putin, French President Emmanuel Macron, and U.S. President Donald Trump called for an ceasefire immediately, and the three were speaking as co-chairs of the OSCE Minsk group, which was founded in the early 1990s to try to find a peaceful solution to the region. So how relevant is the Minsk group today?
The Minsk Group has been around a long time and has done very little to keep the peace, or at least solve the problem. But, as you know, the big news today is that Trump and his wife have they announced positive on the COVID-19. And America's policies have been so erratic and so unpredictable that I would leave them out of this for the time being. But the French president and the Russian president together, I think, are sober thinkers. They're realists about this situation. They want to keep the peace. I thought, by the way, my fellow panelists are extraordinary. Boy, the three of us should get together and try to solve this problem. But that aside, I think that the best bet is that the international community, France and Russia most particularly here, probably Germany as well, who's less centrally involved in this, could sensibly call a meeting of these local leaders and try to deal with the problem. That's, again, I tend to be an optimist in these things. There's no military solution here. There's only some kind of diplomatic solution. But I think what Kamal said is very interesting. For me, new point, it has to be arbitration rather than simple negotiation. It has to come from pressure from outside. The international community has to act as a community interested in solving these local problems.
Kamal, do you think there still are rooms that Azerbaijan and Armenia conflict can be solved diplomatically as we see casualties on both sides?
Well, thank you, Roland. I also think it's an interesting idea that I just returned in the context of the question asked. I am unfortunately do not believe that the diplomacy can solve anything anymore, especially in this kind of conflict. I would say that the military solution is also impossible because it's not going to solve the conflict. The maximum that Azerbaijan can achieve is the occupation of its territories, but that doesn't solve the conflict in any kind of a way. The conflict is going to continue. There's going to be enmity between the states, and there's going to be these problems that will not simply disappear. And that is why the only peaceful solution, in my mind, that is actually feasible is the one that ensures the arbitration, that the international community pushes both Azerbaijan and Armenia towards two things. First, demilitarization of the zone completely, and second, to the arbitration on the international level. It can be some kind of a judicial body, ad hoc created, maybe ICJ, International Court of Justice, something that the sides would be comfortable with arbitrating. But really arbitrating, meaning that it's going to impose the solution in the end. And the good example of that is actually the arbitration that been conducted in the conflict around Åland Islands between the Sweden and Finland. Exactly at the time when the Nagorno-Karabakh as a region with Armenia and Azerbaijan became a part of the Soviet Union in 1921. And because both sides accepted the arbitration, they've been able to reach the lasting agreement on that, and that autonomous region of Finland that was left in Finland by the arbitration, but with predominantly Swedish population of more than 90%, which is even more than in Nagorno-Karabakh, is part of Finland, but with large autonomy. And the solution that is also this area is demilitarized is accepted by all parties. By all parties, not only to the conflict by Sweden and Finland, but all the surrounding regional states, including Russia, that is a member to the treaties that ensure demilitarization and neutralization of Åland Islands. And the solution is there for soon 100 years. So that seems like a good example. Thank you.
Alexei, do you share the same stand? Will an arbitration work in this situation?
Well, it may work, but before we reach arbitration stage, second conditions need to be met. First of all, the conflict has to be extinguished. I come back to the point I made earlier. Mm-hmm. There haven't been taken any prisoners. The level of reported fighting is so high, the ferocity as well as the collateral damage that both sides inflicting on themselves make the current discussions simply impossible. So there are two immediate solutions that have to be reached. First of all, any supply of weaponry, ammunition, and armaments to by external parties to both Armenia and Azerbaijan has to be ceased immediately. If this is not going to take place, and apparently there are reports that both sides continue to receive supply of ammunition and armaments from a number of foreign powers, the conflict will continue to escalate. Clearly, the blitzkrieg, the small victorious war has failed for both, certainly for Azerbaijan and Armenia is not going to achieve any more decisive military success.
Mm-hmm. Even though we are very interested in your insights, but unfortunately we ran out of time for today's panel discussion. That's it for this edition of World Today. Thanks to all of our guests for being with us and their insightful opinions. Makili-Aliyev, affiliated researcher at Lowell Wallenberg Institute in Sweden. Ronald Gregor Suni, professor of history and political science at University of Michigan, and Alexei Murayev, associate professor at the School of Media, Creative Arts and Social Inquiry at Curtin University in Australia. If you want to hear this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. I'm Guyana. Thank you so much for joining us.